How to edit the collisions of a static mesh with C++ in Unreal, because sometimes we need to readjust the collisions a little bit after the mesh is imported. So let's get to it. And here I am in a completely new header file. I'm not gonna say empty this time because we have 5 functions in there. Yeah, there's a lot of little functions, but you'll see it's not gonna be that bad because most of them are pretty similar. And I also have a little forward declaration right here at the top because I want to be able to provide the static mesh directly to my function and tell it, okay, add collisions on that static mesh specifically. That's just going to make things a little bit simpler. So a forward declaration at the top for the UStaticMesh, and then we have our first little function right here, the auto-generate the static mesh collision. And that's the same thing as clicking on the auto-generate collision in Unreal, and that's going to generate collisions automatically for the static mesh that we provide. The static mesh is the first variable right here, so which static mesh onto which we want to generate some collisions, and then we have the same parameters that we have in the editor when we try to generate the collisions from there, so the hull count, the max hull verts, and also the hull precisions, 3 same variables that we have access to in the editor when we try to generate collision automatically. And that's it. That function is going to generate the collisions for you and the job's gonna be done. But what if you generated collision on a static mesh and then you want to delete them? Well, I have a function for you. We have the clear static mesh collisions right here. That function is super simple. You just have to provide the static mesh of which you want to delete the collision, and the function is just going to delete the collision for you. Super easy, super simple. Those two functions are pretty much automatic. You either generate a random collision for your mesh or you remove all the collisions that are on the mesh. But what if you want to generate a specific collision for your mesh? Maybe you want to place 3 boxes on top of each other and that's going to be the collision of your mesh or something like that. Then you'll have to use the 3 next functions that I'm going to show you, because sometimes you need a bit more control than just letting Unreal do everything for you. The next function that I have right here is the add or update the box collision on static mesh. I'm just gonna scroll down a little bit, and that function is, as the name says, simply going to add or update the box collision that is already on the mesh. So you just have to provide the static mesh once again, and also the collision index. So which collision you want to affect. There's maybe 10 boxes on your mesh. Maybe you want to affect the second box or the third box. So that's going to help you decide which collision you want to affect. And then you have all the different settings that are going to affect that collision. So you have the location of the box, the rotation of the box, and the extent of the box. So with that, you'll have full control of where you want to place your box collision onto your mesh. And then you have the exact same thing, but for the sphere collision this time. So add or update sphere collision on static mesh. You provided the static mesh and the collision index one more time. And then using the location and the radius right here, you'll be able to adjust the position of the sphere in the static mesh and also its size. Good. And the last function that we have right here is pretty similar. It's the add or update capsule collision on static mesh. Same thing, you provide the static mesh and the collision index, so which static mesh and which collision shape you want to modify, and then you have a few settings for the location, the rotation, the length, and the radius of the capsule. So you'll be able to place it anywhere you want in the static mesh. So that's about it for the header file. As I said, we have a lot of different functions today, but they are all pretty similar. We're just going to modify different settings. So good, now it's time to jump in the CPP, and as usual, we're going to start with the includes, and today we just have 2 includes. We have the Unreal ED globals, which is going to let us retrieve the Unreal editor, and from the Unreal editor, I'm just going to get access to the static mesh editor subsystem, which already contains all the functions that we need to edit the collisions of the static mesh, and also a bunch of other functions that are affecting static meshes. So the editor that is going to let us retrieve the subsystem, which is going to do pretty much all the work for us today. So okay, these are the 2 includes we're going to need today, and they are inside the Unreal ED module and the static mesh editor module. Let's just make sure that those 2 modules are already in the build.cs file. So here I have my build.cs and I have my Unreal ED module right here, and all the way at the bottom I have my static mesh editor. So good, I have all the modules that I need in my build.cs file, so it's going to compile properly. Good, let's go back in the CPP and take a look at the first function. And the first step of this first function, actually, I'm just going to make sure that this static mesh is actually valid, because if it's not valid, I'm not going to be able to generate a collision for it because, well, it doesn't exist. So here, if the static mesh is null, I'm just going to return right away. Perfect, super simple. Second step is going to be to retrieve the static mesh editor subsystem. So I'm just going to do that right here like that. So in the G-editor, I'm going to do a get editor subsystem to retrieve the UStaticMeshEditorSubsystem. That's going to give me a little pointer to the static mesh editor subsystem, and that's the little guy we're going to use to do pretty much everything we have to do in this video. So the static mesh editor subsystem right here, I'm just going to make sure that it is not equal to null, because if it's not valid, well, I cannot do anything. So I'm just going to return right away. But if it's valid, then I can ask him to generate some collision, and that's actually super simple because the function is already in there. So inside my static mesh editor subsystem, I'm just going to do a set convex decomposition collisions. That's the equivalent of calling the auto generate collision in the editor. So set convex decomposition collisions, you provided the static mesh and also the 3 same variables that we have right here. So the hull count, max box, all verts and all precision, and that's going to generate a collision for you and let you know if it was able to generate that collision. If it failed, well, that boolean right here is going to be false, but if it succeeded, it's going to be a success, and that's what I'm going to do right here. I'm just going to use that little boolean to tell the user if it was a success or a fail, and actually that's it for the first function. Everything's already inside the subsystem, so we don't have much to do. Perfect. Now it's time to take a look at the second function. It is going to be pretty similar. Same thing here. I'm just going to make sure that my static mesh is not equal to null, because if it's not valid, I cannot clear the collision that are on it, because, well, it doesn't exist. And then same thing, I'm going to retrieve my static mesh editor subsystem. So gedit get editor subsystem, UStaticMeshEditorSubsystem, and that's going to give it to me. And once again, I'm going to check if it's valid, and if it's the case, I'm just going to ask him to remove the collisions that are on that static mesh. Super easy, super simple. I can tell my user if it was a success or not, same way as the previous function. Perfect, that one's done too. Then we're gonna take a look at the more complicated function, because in those functions, you'll be able to access directly the collisions that are inside the mesh and do anything you want with them. So I'm just gonna scroll down a little bit to the add or update the box collision on static mesh, and that one is going to start the same exact way as the other ones. I'm just going to make sure that my static mesh I receive as input is valid, otherwise I cannot do anything. But if it's valid, then I want to know if I want to create a new collision for that static mesh, or if I want to use an existing collision that is already on the static mesh. So here I'm going to validate if my collision index that I receive as input is valid or not. So if it's smaller than 0, well, it's not valid, because that's just not a valid index. And then I'm going to compare it with the quantity of box collisions that are already on my mesh, because if it's bigger than those box collisions, well, I cannot take an existing box collision because the index is too big for that one. So I'm just going to take inside my static mesh the body setup, which contains the collisions. The ag geom is the collision meshes that are inside your static mesh, and then inside the whole collisions you have a different list of collision depending on the shapes of your collision. So in this case we have a list of boxes, because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the boxes that are inside the static mesh to see if we want to reuse one of those or simply create a new box, and that's why I'm using the box element list right here and comparing the quantity of boxes that we have in the mesh to the collision index we receive as input. And if we decided that the collision index we receive as input is not valid, then I'm just going to generate a new box collision on my static mesh. So to generate a new box collision, we also need to have access to the editor subsystem once again. So static mesh editor subsystem, same way, and then we check if it's valid. And if it's valid, we can ask him to add a simple collision to our static mesh. So add simple collision, the static mesh, and also the shape of the collision we're interested in. In my case, I want to add a box collision on my static mesh, because we are inside the add or update box collision on static mesh function. So add a new box on the static mesh. It's going to give you the index of that box. So good, we'll be able to use it to retrieve the box collision generated on the static mesh. So that's awesome. But then I'm just going to make sure that this index is actually valid, because if it's smaller than 0, it means that the subsystem was not able to add a box collision onto it. So I'm just going to return if that's the case and say that I failed. I was not able to add a collision onto the static mesh. And when that happens, the user will have to look into the log and see what error message the static mesh editor subsystem gave to him. So let's just hope that it doesn't happen and we'll be able to add collisions onto our static mesh, and that's actually supposed to be fine most of the time. So good. Now we have the new collision index that we're going to use, or actually the ones that we already added at the beginning if it was already valid. And now it's time to simply configure the box collision that we just added or retrieve from the static mesh, and we're going to do that just like this. It's actually super simple. Inside the ag geom, you're going to directly access the box elements that are inside the static mesh, and then pick the one that you want to modify using the collision index, and then you can simply set the variables that are directly on that box collision. So you can set the center using the location that we receive as input, the rotation of the box using the rotation, and then you can set the x, y, and z of the box using the extents that we receive as input. And actually that's it. We spawned a new box collision on your static mesh, and then we configured it properly, so we can simply tell to the user that it was a success. We were able to add a box collision onto the mesh. And before we go to the next function, there's actually a little note right here. If you don't configure the box collision the way you want just to leave it as is by default, the default is that inside the add simple collision function, the subsystem is simply going to generate a box that is overlapping the whole mesh. So it's like a bounding box over your mesh. It's just going to generate a bounding box, and it's going to be the same thing for the sphere collision. It's just going to generate a sphere that is going to overlap the whole mesh, and same thing for the capsule. So if you're not configuring the collisions yourself, it's just going to create one big collision overlapping the whole mesh, and maybe that's what you want. But in my case, since I wanted to show that we could have more control if we needed to, I'm going to configure all my shapes manually. But if you don't need to configure them and you just want one big box, you can simply call the add a simple collision just one time. It's just going to place the box around your mesh, and that's going to be fine. Good, okay. That's it for this shape, for the box shape. And then we have the same thing, but for the sphere and the capsule, and they are actually pretty much the same. So we're gonna go pretty fast. First thing, we're gonna check if the static mesh we receive as input is valid, as usual. Then we're gonna check if the collision index is valid, or if we need to create a new sphere collision onto our mesh. This time we're gonna take a look at the sphere elements list. We're not gonna take a look at the box list because we want to add a sphere onto our static mesh, not a box. So that sphere is going to end up inside this list and not the box list, obviously. So we're just going to make sure to compare with this list instead of the box list. And same thing, if we find that our index is not valid and we need to create a new box, we're just going to do it like this. We're just going to retrieve the editor static mesh subsystem, and then we're simply going to ask him to add a simple collision onto our static mesh, and the shape should be a sphere, obviously. And that's going to return you the collision index that we can then check to see if we were able to add a sphere collision onto our mesh or not. And if we were not able to, we're just going to return right away. But if the collision index is valid, either because the sphere was already on the static mesh or if we created a new sphere on the static mesh, then we'll be able to configure that sphere, and it's super simple, same as the box. We're just going to do it that way. Inside the ActGeom, we're going to access the sphere LMs, and the collision index is going to let you decide which sphere you want to modify, and then you can simply modify the center, which is going to be the location of the sphere in the static mesh, and then the radius of the sphere in your static mesh, and that's it. Then you can tell the user that it was a success, you were able to add a sphere in your static mesh, and it's going to be the same exact thing for the last function. So I'm going to scroll all the way down right here, and super quickly we're going to check if the static mesh is valid as before. Then we're going to check if the collision index is valid. This time we're going to use this fill LM list, which is the list of capsules that are on the mesh, and not the sphere, not the boxes, really the capsule list. So the fill LM list right here, make sure that the index is valid. If it's not valid, we're going to create a new capsule. So same thing, get the editor subsystem, ask him to add a new simple collision onto our mesh. So add simple collision onto the static mesh using the capsule shape this time. That's going to give you an index. That index you can then make sure that it is valid, and if it is valid, then you'll be able to configure your capsule, and that's what you're going to do right here. So static mesh, get body setup, ActGeom, spill LM list. Inside that one, you're going to pick the collision that you want, so the collision index, and then you can adjust its center, which is going to be the location of this capsule inside the static mesh, the rotation of the capsule, the length of the capsule, and the radius of the capsule. And actually that's it, and we're done with this function, and we're done with all the different functions, and now it's time to jump in Unreal to add a bunch of different collisions. And here I am in Unreal in a pretty empty level as usual, and I have a little tree right here, and that's on this tree we're going to generate collisions, remove collisions, and test all our different functions. Right now the tree doesn't have any collisions. If I hover my static mesh right here, we can see that the collision primitive is equal to 0, and same thing in my level right now, I'm showing the collision, so the collision checkbox right here is checked, which means that it should display all the collisions, and right now my mesh doesn't have any collisions, so it doesn't display anything. And as usual, we're going to add collisions onto it using a user interface that I have right here. If we take a look at it, yeah, it's a little bit scary. There's a lot of numbers in there, and it's simply because I added all the different variables that we can provide to our functions when we call them. So here, when I'm calling the generate collision function, I can provide the hull count, max hull verts, and hull precision. And same thing for when I'm trying to call the add or update box collision. I have all those numbers right here. Same thing for the sphere, same thing for the capsule, and same thing for the, actually, no, not same thing for the clear collision, because that one doesn't have any variables. It simply clears all the collisions, so it doesn't have to provide any variables to them. But for all the other ones, there's a bunch of different variables that we can provide, so that's why right here my user interface is a little bit messy. And actually, it's the same thing for my blueprint. Since I wanted to show everything on one screen, it's also a little bit messy. Yeah. But at least all the nodes are there, so you can see that I'm simply calling all the 5 functions I created today. So all those functions right here, I'm simply calling them, and I'm simply providing all the different inputs from my user interface. So all the different spin boxes have numbers in them, and I'm simply feeding them to our functions. And for all those functions, I'm always using the same static mesh. So the 039 my mesh, which is the mesh that I have in my scene, I'm always using that one. So I'm always going to affect the same mesh. So 039 my mesh, 039 my mesh, same everywhere. And now that we've seen that the user interface is pretty messy, it's time to use that messy user interface. Yeah, let's see how it goes. I'm gonna right click and run the editor utility widget right here. It's going to open my window. It's still as messy as before, but I have a few buttons and I can click some of them. So I'm gonna try by generating collision first to see if it works. It generated a few collision, and you can see in the scene that, well, my tree now has some collision. Hey, that's pretty nice. I can change the hull count to see if it affects the collision. Well, it didn't. Okay, make it a little bit lower to see if it changes something. Oh, that changes my collision, and then I can affect the values a little bit to see how it impacts the result. Yeah, these collisions are a little bit more representative of the shape of the object. Same time, I can reduce the resolution, and we can see that the collisions are a little bit bigger around the objects. But anyway, we can see that it works, and it gives actually the same result as if you call this same function inside the static mesh, because, well, that's exactly the same code. So you have the same result. Maybe it's good enough for you or not. And if it's not, well, you can add all those different shapes manually if you want. So I'm just going to clear my collision. Here we go. I resetted my mesh, and now I don't have any collision, and I can try to add a box to it. Here we go. I have a box. It's all the way at the bottom right here, so I'm going to try to move it up a little bit. Here we go. Move the box. Oh, it created a new box because my index right here is still set to -1, so I'm not affecting the first box I created. I just created a new box. So I'm just going to increase my index to, let's say, 0, and now everything I change should affect that box that is at the bottom. So I'm going to, let's say, make it bigger this time. I'm going to try to make it bigger. Update. Oh, I also moved it up because my value in Z is still high up in the air. So here we go. Now I can move my box around to place it wherever I want. And actually I can just move it out of the way because, well, we have a bunch of collisions to add. So I'm going to move my cube out of the way. I can try the rotation to see if it works. I can rotate my cube, rotate the cube, rotate the cube, and I can create as many cubes as I want. So I can just create another cube on top of it, another cube on top of it, another cube, and another cube, another, and here we go. It looks a little bit messy. So that was for the cube. Now we can do the same thing for the sphere. So I'm going to add the sphere right here at the bottom. Yay, I have a nice sphere. I can move it up a little bit. This time I'm not going to make the same mistake. So I'm going to increase my index to the index is 0 and move it up a little bit. I'm going to make it bigger also. There we go. I have a bigger sphere right here. A little bit too big, maybe make it smaller. And you can place the sphere wherever you want. So maybe a bigger sphere. Actually, no, I'm going to make it small and I'm going to place it all the way at the top. There we go. It seems to work. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. Here we go. I have a nice little sphere right here. And same thing, I can add a bunch of spheres. So let's say I'm going to move my spheres all the way there at the bottom. Oh no, actually it's still in the air. Here we go. I can add one sphere there. I can one sphere here, one sphere there. I can place them anywhere I want. I can adjust the radius too to make it a little bit messy, same as my cubes. And actually it's too messy. I'm just going to clear my collision and now I'm just going to focus on the capsule. I'm going to start by adding a capsule. Here we go. I have a basic capsule. I'm going to make it a little bit higher. So let's say select the index is 0, move it a little bit high. Here we go. It seemed to work. I'm going to adjust the length because it's a bit too tall right now. So make it a little bit shorter. Same thing for the radius. Oh, it's a bit too short. Here we go. A little bit taller. And here we go. Now I have a nice little capsule around my tree. It seemed to work. Perfect. And same thing, I can probably add as many capsules as I want right there if I want to. I can also try the rotation. Yes, I can rotate my capsule and it seemed to work perfectly. Good. So now I can clear my collision because it was not really nice. I can use the simple generate collision to generate some basic collisions. And actually that's about it. It seems to work. And even if I open my static mesh right here, we can see that, oh, it doesn't display the collision right now. So I'm just going to show my simple collision. We can see that I have the same collisions that were generated in my scene and it seemed to work perfectly. Perfect. So I guess that's going to conclude today's video and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye.